And welcome back as we go ahead and dive into looking at the difference between private and public modifiers. We have, of course, seen these kind of in our programs already, and we haven't really talked about them yet. But now we're going to go ahead and take a look at what does it actually mean to make something private versus making something public. So this is, of course, going to lead into this idea of information hiding. Information hiding simply means that you're separating the description of how to use a class from the implementation details, such as how the methods are defined. This is typically done so the programmer who uses the class does not need to know the implementation details of that class definition. You don't necessarily need to know how does this method work, you just need to know to use that method. The programmer can then consider the details hidden since they don't need to look at them. Information hiding is a way of avoiding, therefore, information overload. You're not going to overwhelm the programmer with all these different things that they need to know. It also keeps the information needed by the programmer within reasonable bounds in a process that we call abstraction, because we're keeping it so that way, again, you're not being overloaded. This is kind of what you need to know in order to have your program execute in a manner that's wanting it to be the best that you can do. Now let's take a look at how we can do that with our modifiers to start off. We're going to start off by first talking about encapsulation. Now, encapsulation means to group software into a unit in such a way that it's easy to use because there's a well-defined, simple interface. Now, Java has a way of officially hiding details of a class definition. To hide details, we simply are going to mark them as private. Now, what does that mean, marking as private? Well, there's another term we have to kind of throw around here, which is the term of API. API just stands for Application Programming Interface. And when we start talking about this with our classes, well, this is a description of how to use that class. And we're not going to worry about how to develop full-blown APIs and stuff like that, but just know that this is kind of a generalized term that we're going to encounter, or you might encounter, or maybe you've even seen when you start reading things about the web. Now, if your class is well designed and going to use the encapsulation techniques that we're going to discuss, then any programmer who uses your class only needs to read the API, so the documentation. And they don't necessarily have to know the details of how your code works. Like, for example, if you have a toString method, they might say, like, okay, how do I use your toString method? You don't need to know the detailed methods. Like, I don't need to know what variables are in there. Everything like, oh, you have a toString method. Let me just call .toString, and then it's going to do its thing. Now, going back to those public and private modifiers, if we compare the instance variables from our date first try and our date second try classes, you'll notice something. All right, in the first class that we had the variables having the public modifier. In the second try class and onward, we've switched to using the private modifier. Public simply means there's no restrictions on where those instance variables can be used. Whereas private means those instance variables can be accessed by a name, or you can think of it as another class outside of that class definition. So, for example, when we had our main class, our driver, our demo classes, we could, of course, if it was public, I can go ahead and access directly the date first try. You know, if I had a date one object, for example, I could say date one dot month. But if I did that with date second try and I said date two dot month, I would get an error. So let's talk a little bit about that use of private. The following, of course, will produce a compiler error if we use this in a program. This is what I was just talking about. If we have a date second try, and I try to use date one dot month equals January, or date one dot day, or date one dot year, again, if you remember, what do we say about those variables? They are private. And while any of the variable assignments we're looking at right here would, of course, trigger an error, the reason why that error occurs is, again, because these variables have been switched from a public modifier to a private modifier. And you might be wondering, well, why is this? Why is this a big deal? And we'll get to all of that as we dive a little bit deeper here into our private and public usage. Now, if we did this, of course, with day first try, we will not get any errors here because, again, as we mentioned, these are public. So let's talk a little bit about public versus private here. It's generally considered to be good programming practice to make all your instance variables private. This is, of course, intended to simplify the task of the programmer who uses the class. They don't necessarily need to know how your instance variables are being used. They just need to know that they can access them. Now, once you label an instance variable private, there's no way to change its value nor reference the instance variable in any other way except by using one of the methods that belongs to class. And again, we'll talk more about these type of methods as we dive deeper. Now note, when a variable is marked as private, you technically can still access it through those methods of the class. And those two methods we're going to call set and get methods, or access or mutator methods. But don't have to worry about that right now, because again, we're going to focus that on a little bit later down the road here. So with those public and private modifiers, the modifiers, you'll notice, those don't simply just exist for variables, but they can also come before our methods. All right, and they have a very similar role here. If a method is marked as public, that means we can use it freely. All right, any class that is having access to it can call that method name. But if it's marked as private, the method can only be used in the definition of another method of that same class. Any instance variable or method that can exist within your program can therefore be labeled as private or public, and we label it according to the need that we have to have it fulfill. Good programming practices say that, hey, if you have an instance variable, mark them as private. All right, and most of your methods are going to be public. And that's a general rule of thumb to follow. That's pretty good. Now, typically when we look at methods, though, these are only going to be private typically if they're like a helping method, or they're helping to calculate another method, for example, that your program is going to use, or they're in the definition of another method. So let's talk about this with the date try classes that we've been looking at. If we look at the use of private and public in the date class, date fifth try, which we'll look at here in just a second, you'll notice that all the instance variables are private, and we have two methods that are marked as private. Those methods are dateOK and monthString because they are considered to be helping methods. A user of the program can't use either of those two methods. You can't go into your main class and call like date1.dateOK. It's not going to work. This is an example of hidden information that does not concern the programmer using the class because, for example, the dateOK, which we'll look at in a second, it's just checking to see if it's a valid date. And although all the instance variables are private, a programmer can, that uses that class can still change or access the available those instance variables using the set or get methods that we've talked about. So with date fifth try, let's look at that first method, the dateOK, to make sure that any changes to those instance variables make sense. Well, because of the methods of the class use the method dateOK, check for impossible dates, you cannot use methods such as read input or set date to set those instance variables to impossible dates because, again, it's going to make sure that they're valid. If you attempt to do so, your program is going to end with an error. All right. Now, it is not, like I say, a foolproof check because there are some exceptions with how we have it set up here, and we'll show that in the implementation. For example, we have February 31st. Even though that's not a valid date, it technically will get through. And you could, of course, fine-tune this dateOK to be much more, fine-grained. But again, just to kind of get it started, it'll be something for us to look at. Now, the methods dateOK and equals, you'll notice both return type Boolean. That means that they're going to return a value that's either true or false, and therefore you can use it as either a Boolean expression, or you can use that like an if-else statement, a while loop, or any other kind of loop expression that's going to require you to use that. Now, this is, of course, going to lead us to a little bit of a conversation about inside versus an outside view of our code. There is, of course, a difference when we start talking about these two views of a class. So a date such as July 4th, 1776 is represented inside of our class object as a string value July and the two int values 4 and 1776. But if a programmer using that same class object asks for the date using getMonth, getDay, and getYear, they would, of course, get 7, 4, and 1776. This is because when you're inside of that class, when you're looking at the actual object details, month is a string. But outside, it's an integer, because remember, we, of course, can convert between those two values. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is method order, because obviously we're starting to get a lot of methods that we can easily start adding into our class. We'll see this when we look at date fifth try. There's a lot of methods there. Well, method definitions in a class need not be given in any particular order. All right, so you don't necessarily have to have, for example, your toString at the top or at the bottom. You can kind of put it wherever you want. I mean, generally speaking, like when I do my code personally, I'll put my toString and my equals at the end because I know those are always going to be classes in need. Or I might put them always at the top. Generally speaking, I put them more near the bottom because I know then they're out of the way where I can kind of work near the top where I'm working. But again, you don't have to do it one way or another. It's perfectly acceptable that our method definitions for date OK are after the definitions that use date OK. You'll see this when we look at our code. Instead, we can just use whatever ordering makes sense for the class easiest to read. Again, it just depends. Sometimes things are going to be the top, sometimes the bottom, sometimes they're in the middle. Now, later on, though, we will discuss a concept known as constructors. And these you can almost think of as special methods, even though they're not quite the same. These are recommended that we place them at the top of our class after instance variables. It doesn't require it. Notice it says recommended. I personally recommend it just because it makes it easier, since I know that it's part of how I make that class, and kind of like I need instance variables to make that class. So a lot of times I'll put the constructors at the top. But again, we'll talk about those later. And here we are taking a look at date fifth try. One of the things you'll see is we have our date OK right here. So this is just an if statement that says, see if the date is OK, and if it is, then we can set the date. And that's from our read input here. Notice this is a much more cleaned up version than necessarily the version we've done previously to check for valid dates and stuff like that. Because what it's done is it's taken this little, before we could do the same thing. We just had a huge long if statement that ran out all the way across here. However, we've extracted that code, we've refactored it into its own method. And that method, of course, if you look, is date OK. So let's come down here and then go look at where date OK is. And you can see date OK is simply taking in an int, and an int. And of course, it's then looking to see if those values are correct. All right, it's looking for month, day, and year. Now again, we could, of course, factor this in a lot more to hone in. For example, we want to do February, we could create another condition in here for if the month it is equal to 2, and we can, of course, then check to see if that day range is in the correct range. Now, the other things to keep in mind here, as we start looking at these methods, you notice, again, there is no particular order for them. We have month string here, of course, is private now because month string no longer needs to be accessed, because all it's doing is just changing that value into an int for other methods, such as the date OK, to be able to use that. And again, you'll see date OK, if I go ahead and highlight that, it exists here, but is also used in our set date, because both those methods are looking to see that the date that we're entering is valid. And these, of course, are helping methods that we can use to make our code more robust. And as we continue to look at different things with private and public, you're going to see some of these things start popping up, and you might wonder, okay, which one should I do? Just, if in doubt, your methods, start them public, and your variables, start them private.